Hello and welcome. Has radical Islam found a platform in Britain's universities? That question's been raised in the wake of the attempted Christmas Day airline bombing for which Osama bin Laden recently claimed credit. The accused attacker on Northwest Airlines Flight 253, Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, was allegedly introduced to radical views while studying at University College London. Serving as president of the Student Islamic Society, he reportedly organized a, quote, war on terror week and invited controversial speakers to campus. Well, the school's officials denied that the would-be bomber was radicalized at their university, but some analysts say it's a pattern that's becoming too familiar at British education institutions, with a clear link between certain university organizations and radical thought. In fact, Abdul Muttalib is the fourth former head of a British University Islamic Society to have been charged with a serious terrorism offence. Muslim student associations counter that any attempt to ban unpopular speech, even if it is considered by some to be radical, is censorship and violates principles of free expression. They also say their community is being unfairly targeted. Well, today we ask, how susceptible are students in British universities to accepting radical doctrine, and at what point does free speech become the casualty of security measures? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Well, I'm joined by Professor Anthony Glees, Director of Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. He's the co-author of a recent study, When Students Turn to Terror, Terrorist and Extremist Activity on British Campuses. Also here is Faisal Hanjra, the President of the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, or FOSIS. Mr. Hanjra addressed the recent debate regarding the UK's call to limit freedom of speech, which he says will only bring mistrust and resentment among Muslim students. And joining us from Chicago is Azim Ibrahim, the strategic advisor of the Solas Foundation in Scotland, which aims to reduce radicalization, providing education in authentic Islamic scholarships. Gentlemen, I thank you all for taking part. And Professor, I'm going to start with you first. You say that radical extreme views are so much a part of the diet of Islamic student life that it's hard to separate legitimate dissent from hate propaganda. So what makes you feel, or what makes you think that Islamic radicalism and Islamic student life are so interlinked?
Well, I think the answer is really provided by our government and by our security service. Mr. Abdul Muttalib was being watched. He was a blip on the radar of MI5 when he was a student at University College in London from 2005 to 2008. And the Home Secretary, our Home Secretary in Britain, told Parliament on the 5th of January of this year that there were a small number of al-Qaeda recruiters targeting learners at our colleges and universities. Now, when you add these facts to the fact you've already mentioned, that Abdul Muttalib was the fourth Islamic Society chairman to be charged with the most serious terrorist offences, and then again add the significant number of students and recent graduates who have turned to terror in the United Kingdom in the past 10 years or so, you get a situation which is the cause of serious concern.
Professor, in a nutshell, what do you propose be done about this threat that you perceive?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's very important to see this is not an attack on free speech. We don't have absolute free speech in the United Kingdom, nor should we. We are a society with people of all sorts of ethnic backgrounds, all sorts of religions, and there are caps on free speech to prevent people like that from being attacked. But radicalization, which leads to violent extremism, radicalization which leads to Islamist violent extremism, is a scourge. And if students go to universities, they go there to learn. They go to learn how to be civilized. They learn about an inclusive society that is blind to religion, blind to sexuality, and blind to ethnic origin. Now, if universities in the United Kingdom cannot sustain a culture which allows the individual student to be at one with these values, it's failing in its duty. And you know, it's not people like me who are undermining free speech. The people who are undermining free speech are the people who radicalize so that a small number, and it is a small number, of young Muslim men and women feel that the only way they can change society is through violence. That's the real attack on free speech.
Okay, we'll touch on some of the issues that you're raising here in a moment, Professor. Let me bring in Faisal Hanjra here. I know you've had this discussion a number of times and have had to defend the position of Muslim students. Let me ask you what you make of the claims and concerns the Professor's been discussing.
I think certainly listening to Professor Anthony Glees, he paints a picture of really, you know, this widespread issue of radicalization. It's an almost hysterical portrait of what's going on in university campuses. The reality, though, is far different, and the reality is very much in keeping with what organisations like the National Union of Students, the body that represents 7 million students, Universities UK, the body that represents vice-chancellors, UCU, the body that represents teachers at universities, and even the government. And consistently across the board, those people who are working at the grassroots level have come out and said that universities are not these arenas of radicalisation, that Muslim students just simply are not susceptible to this process of radicalisation. Crucially, and I think it's very important, that Professor Anthony Glees' analysis of the situation has been widely discredited. What he's done is he's put together a list of people who've gone on to commit terror attacks many, many years, some of them many, many years after leaving university, and he suggested that just because they, at one stage in their life, happened to attend a British institution, that somehow Islamic societies are accountable for that. That's utterly absurd.
I'll get that to him in a second. Let me ask you one thing, though, Faisal, that how is that association between extremism and Muslim students and university students affecting perhaps hurting Muslim students in Britain?
Well, this is, I think, why I feel so passionate about it, because since 7/7, Muslim students have had to live under this cloud of suspicion, which has been pushed particularly by certain individuals within the academic sphere, which hasn't been brought in by, the argument hasn't been accepted by the government and by, like I said, the bodies who are looking after the welfare of the students on campus. What this is doing is feeding this fear and feeding this suspicion on campuses, which simply is mislaid.
Now, let me bring in Azim Ibrahim here in Chicago. Azim, I know you've been very concerned about the way there is some radicalization of Muslims, and I know you're concerned about trying to change the status quo. Let me ask you first of all, from the research you've done and you've encountered, what are the key factors that you see that cause radicalization of any student or any young person?
Well, I was asked to put together a policy memo a few years ago on the mechanics of radicalisation and future trends and how they will impact radicalisation over the next few decades. I was asked to put this memo together for the British government, and during my research I came across a very interesting and striking fact, in that almost all Islamic radicals had absolutely no training whatsoever in the authentic Islamic sciences. And the reason for that was actually quite straightforward. If they had any training in authentic Islamic science and theology, they would realise that their bloody methods are an absolute contravention to Islam. And this is absolutely true for not only the 9/11 hijackers, but also the 7/7 bombers and also other freelance cells. And even if you look at the leadership of al-Qaeda, none of them have actually had any sort of Islamic training in the classical sense. And our belief and our philosophy within the SOLAS Foundation is to use authentic Islamic science, authentic Islamic scholarship, to teach young students the proper ways and doctrine of Islam in order to immunise them against a radical narrative, so that when they are exposed to such narratives, they can identify it for the perversion that it actually is.
Azim, in a line then, basically, if there's no authentic Islamic training, what is the main factor that's causing these young people to radicalise to that degree?
Yeah, well, the radicalisation process, the mechanics of radicalisation, an individual goes through a number of processes. It is usually sparked off when an individual reacts to Muslim suffering throughout the globe with moral outrage. The second step is usually when he links that suffering into the wider context of a war between Islam and the West. The third step is usually they will identify that suffering with their own personal experiences, discrimination, Islamophobia, racism, or even the inability to get a job despite having the correct qualifications. And the final stage is when that individual seeks a radical network, which then cocoon him in a self-enforcing intellectual environment, isolating himself from the outside world. But the problem we have in many of these university campuses and many of these mosques in the United Kingdom is that we simply do not have the authentic Islamic scholarship that can immunise young people against this kind of narrative. And what we have done with the SOLAS Foundation is that we have two young Scottish-born Islamic scholars, both educated in the UK, but have studied with some of the highest authorities in the Islamic world, and they have the correct qualifications. They have the correct, what we will call the ijazas, the licenses, with the correct sanad, the correct chain that goes back to the founders of Islam, and their qualifications cannot be disputed, not even by Osama bin Laden himself. So we are offering young people authentic Islamic scholarship, and we have had significant impact on the ground already.
Let me get a quick question in, a quick email question to the Professor. This came in from a viewer who sent it through Facebook, Melissa Chetty. And sir, if I could put this to you, it says, continuously pressuring, isolating and drawing attention to Muslim students just for the sake of their religion is a major cause of their apparent radical behaviour. Who wouldn't want to retaliate after a university that is supposed to be built on knowledge, liberty and philosophy begins to single out students of a particular religion due to political pressure? And I wonder, could this sort of highlighting of students and sort of focusing on them so much actually be responsible for creating some kind of resent that might lead to the radicalisation along the path that Azim Ibrahim has just described, sir?
Well, the answer is that nobody is focusing attention on Muslim students. Muslims are the largest single victims of Islamist al-Qaeda violence. I believe very strongly in an education system that is blind to race, blind to gender, and blind to religion. So the argument that I'm somehow putting forward an anti-Muslim agenda is wicked, and it is quite false. Now, if you turn to the other things that people have said, Faisal, for example, he says there is no such thing as radicalization. In the case of Mr. Abdul Muttalab, his friends and his tutors at the college said there was no sign that he was radicalized. However, MI5 had him on their radar. So either the friends knew nothing about him, which is perfectly possible, or he was no different in his attitudes from theirs. And this was somebody that almost killed 300 people in the skies above Detroit on Christmas Day and countless others on the flight path below. So this is something we have to take seriously. And Faisal says, oh, I'm discredited. Well, discredited, hysterical,
Professor,
I will let your viewers decide.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought because we have to take a break here, but we are going to get back to more of this discussion in just a moment. Get a chance for a response from Faisal as well. We'll be right back. Welcome back. At what point do British universities have to curtail free speech for their students in order to keep them safe from those who would preach radical religious doctrine? We're examining the suspicion that exists following the radicalization of a number of British students. Professor Anthony Glees is Director of Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. He's joining us. Faisal Hanjra is heading up FOSIS, an umbrella organisation for Islamic societies at universities here in the UK. And Azim Ibrahim is the strategic advisor of the SOLAS Foundation in Scotland. Let's get back to some questions here. And Faisal, as I get your response to what the professor was saying, let me also put an email question we got from a viewer in the UK, Sanjay Singh, who wrote in saying, why is there more radicalization in the UK as compared to other nations like France, which has 5 million Muslim inhabitants? Is that the case, actually?
Okay, so just to address what Anthony Glees just said, what we've been calling for since 7/7 is an evidence-based approach to tackling the issue of extremism. What is very clear in regards to the case of Umar Farooq Abdul Muttalib is a couple of things. Number one, it's crucially important that due process is allowed to take its course and that the case is allowed to be brought to court and a fair trial be had. During that process, what we need to know as a matter of urgency is exactly what happened in the 15 months after he left UCL, after he left his university. Everybody who knew him at university and everything he did at university while he was the president, being the president of an Islamic society is a very open public position, so your actions are always scrutinized. Everybody who knew him would not have for a second suggested or anticipated the kind of event which we saw on the 25th of December. The suggestion that MI5 somehow had him on their list, which made him automatically a suspect, is absurd. They've got many, many Muslims and many, many Muslim students on their list, including probably myself. The Home Secretary and Gordon Brown have both come out and said that they do not believe that he was radicalized in the UK, that there was a clear Yemen link, etc. So again, for Professor Glees to use that as a basis to pin a university to this case, I think is hugely irresponsible.
Okay, we had a couple of callers who've been standing by very patiently. Nick in Washington, thank you for your patience. Please, let's get your question in.
Yes, well, first I want to make a comment. I'm having to watch you on my iPhone because it's Al Jazeera is censored here in the United States. You can't watch it on cable or on satellite. So I am against censorship, even on campus.
It is actually available.
Even though
go ahead.
Campus. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
No, I was just going to say it is available in some places. There are many issues involved here, but thank you for watching us on the iPod. Is there something you want to contribute as such?
Yes, I'm a University of Washington graduate in political science, and I am for free speech on campus, no matter how objectionable or how radical. And my feeling is that students aren't radicalized because of free speech. As a Croatian American, during the 91, 92, 93, 95 wars in the Balkans and Croatia and Bosnia, I knew many American Croats who were born here who went back to fight and completely disobeyed the laws of the United States by helping smuggle all kinds of material to the Croats in Croatia and Croats in Bosnia and Muslims in Bosnia to help them survive. So my feeling is it's not radicalization on campuses isn't the problem. The problem is diaspora and what happens to these people when they're far away from home, their families, their kinship to another country, to their country, or their ancestry, and when it's being victimized by an oppressor. And I'm not saying that America is the oppressor in Afghanistan, but I can understand how someone being in the diaspora can become radicalized and angered because of what they see as injustices done by the United States and Britain and NATO, for example.
Right. Nick, thank you very much for that contribution. Let's also get Mohammed in London, who's been standing by too. Mohammed, your contribution, please.
Hi, good evening here in London. First of all, let me say Professor Anthony Glees is absolutely right, as a Muslim myself. And quite frankly, the Muslim communities, whether they are here in the United Kingdom or whether they are in America or the rest of the world, unless they challenge themselves to come out, not because the politician is said, or not because the media establishment is said, unless they come out and look after their children's behavior, sadly. For example, what is called Hizb Tahrir here, who said we wanted to put a black flag under the Downing Street. We don't even acknowledge Her Majesty the Queen. Even though they live here, they born here, they don't understand which other country they belong to.
Okay.
Then I think the Muslim...
Let me get Mohammed? Mohammed, thank you for that. Let me get that point across to Azim Ibrahim, who's joining us from Chicago. Azim, that's one thing that when it comes to being born in another country, having certain loyalties, how do you, through your foundation at least, try to encourage people to have some kind of balance between what they might feel in terms of loyalty to another region and, of course, the loyalty to their homeland, adopted homeland?
Well, you're assuming that there is a contradiction between the loyalties, which I do not believe that there is. You know, I myself am a British-born Muslim, and I feel that I'm a better Muslim because I am born in the United Kingdom, and I believe that I'm a better British citizen because I'm a Muslim. And as you're aware, Riz, you know, I spent a number of years wearing the Queen's uniform, a period of my life which I'm extremely proud of, and which I had the great honour of actually doing. I don't believe that there's a contradiction there at all. But I'd like to touch upon one of the point that your previous caller from Washington made, and he makes a very salient point indeed, is that foreign policy is certainly problematic, though I do not believe it is a defining primary factor in the radicalisation process. It is certainly an exacerbating factor, and the period that your caller mentioned, the war in Bosnia, was certainly, I recall when I was still in high school during the war in the Balkans. You know, it's very difficult to counter the argument that an illegal arms embargo has been imposed on white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims for any other reason except that the fact that they're Muslims. And even Bill Clinton in his autobiography said that you know, many European leaders said that, you know, their motivation behind the arms embargo was simply because they did not want to have an Islamic state in Europe. And when I was discussing the radicalisation process, you know, one of the steps I mentioned is that person sees individual wars as in a wider context as a war between between Islam and the West, and this is part of the exacerbating factors. You know, they will look all over the world. They look at Iraq, they look at Afghanistan, they look at Palestine, they look at Bosnia, they look at Somalia, they look at Pakistan, and there's a pattern that emerges, and that is that every single war in the world, there's Muslims that are being killed, there are Muslims that are being discriminated against, and that fits in very nicely into the worldview of the radicals. And it's not something that I obviously believe, but you know, it certainly reinforces a narrative that there is a war between Muslims and the West.
Let me get a question into Professor Anthony Glees here that came in from Pakistan by email. Chowdhury Ahmed wrote in, sir, saying, I believe the word extremism needs a proper definition first, and free speech is a norm which attracts students from across the world to come to Britain. So in your opinion, sir, what point do universities have to compromise between curtailing free expression and free speech and protecting you know, the security of the country?
Well, the truth is that there is not absolute free speech, particularly not in Britain. And it's got nothing to do with the current situation. There never has been. You, as a journalist, will know that you cannot say whatever you like in Britain about somebody else. Indeed, people come from all over the world to the libel courts of London in order to stop people saying whatever they want. The truth is that universities are no different in this respect from other places, except in one regard. People come to university to study and to learn the truth. People come to get a balanced, rational view on things. And the truth is that where radicalization leads to violent extremism, it cannot be accepted.
Professor?
And I think that's your Washington point is wrong. Yep.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt you there, Professor, only because we've reached a hard point where we have to end the show, and I thank you for joining. I thank all my guests for taking part. I hope we get a chance to touch on this subject once again. Now, I thank you for being with us too. Now, remember, you can follow the program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified of upcoming topics, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, with a struggling economy and a nation at war, what does the future of Britain hold? We'll talk to a diverse group of young professionals and ask them about their hopes as their country heads to general elections this summer. Be sure to tune in from that. That's it from me and the team in DC and in London. We'll see you next time.